This is Talking Work. I'm Deborah Ishihara. How might climate change shape employment law and practice in future? We're going to take a look at this weighty question today with one of our most interesting thinkers. Welcome to Talking Work, the employment law podcast by Jus Laboris. In each episode, we invite a different guest to discuss what's happening in the world of work. If you're an HR professional of any kind, this podcast is for you. My guest today is James Davies from our UK law firm Lewis Silkin. I really enjoy talking to James because he spends a lot of time thinking around the big questions, and I learn something new from him every time. Hello, James. Really great to have you here.
Hi, Deborah. Good to be here again.
So, James, you wrote an article recently on climate change and the impact it's likely to have on the world of work. In a nutshell, what will businesses need to do to respond to the climate emergency?
Well, they'll need to respond in two distinct ways. Firstly, they'll need to take steps to prepare for and respond to the consequences of climate change, including, for example, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and shock weather events, such as the extreme temperatures we've seen recently and the floods that we've also seen around the world. But secondly, they'll need to take steps to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate further global warming.
Okay, so looking at your number one then, if temperatures rise and we get more flooding and extreme weather, what will businesses be expected to do to support the health and safety of their workforces?
Well, I think that in some cases, businesses will need to look at the locations from which they operate. Are there locations which are particularly vulnerable to extreme temperatures, flooding, or other risks? Do they need to take additional steps to protect workers from the risks? One can imagine, for example, the recent tornadoes in Kentucky and neighboring US states resulting in a reassessment of workplace building standards around there. In other cases, employers will need to consider steps to cater for changing climate even where, perhaps like the UK, they may be less vulnerable to extreme climate events. In the UK, for example, many offices are not designed for temperatures which may become more common in the years ahead. Here, employers have a legal duty to safeguard employees' health and well-being, and workplace temperature may well become an example of a significant feature in workplace health and safety assessments in the future.
Okay, so moving on to the second of your themes, which is how each business should try to reduce its environmental impact. Now, there's been environmental law in place for decades in most parts of the world, covering the use of air, land, water, and how to dispose of waste. And those rules have affected industries such as manufacturing, typically. But what I want to talk about today is employment law. James, is there much legislation in place so far from governments around the world obliging businesses that have workforces in ordinary offices or these days at home to take steps to reduce their environmental impact?
Not much so far, but this is likely to change. An example of this we can see is in France, where new laws have recently been introduced obliging employers to inform and consult with their social and economic committees on the environmental implications of business decisions affecting the workforce.
Okay, so you say this is likely to change, but what might be the drivers of that?
I think politics drives a lot of change. Governments have set themselves challenging targets to reduce greenhouse emissions, and ensuring businesses play their part will be important. Green policies are likely to become increasingly important in electoral success, whether embraced by traditional parties or, as we can see in Germany, by the rise of green parties. And in Germany, as we know, the Green Party is now one of the coalition partners and in a position of quite significant influence on Germany's policies moving forward.
And what about the different stakeholders in businesses, James? How will they influence what's happening? I'm thinking here of the whole range: customers, shareholders and investors, and workers and their representatives.
And that's a good question, because I think the stakeholders are going to be even more significant in driving change. I think this will come from employees, customers, investors, and communities. In order to attract and retain the best people, organizations will increasingly need to promote their responsible business credentials, including their environmental credentials. Customers, I think, will also take into account more and more organizations' environmental footprints in making buying decisions. And we can see with investors the dramatic rise in importance of ESG ratings in the making of investment decisions.
So, just getting practical here, what kinds of policies could employers put in place to support their workers in reducing their environmental impact?
Well, we see examples of various policies in a whole host of areas, ranging from reduced consumption, so reduced power consumption, reduced consumption of other resources, whether that's paperless offices, reviewing the food served in cafeterias, disposable plastic cups. There's a whole host of steps being taken to reduce consumption. Reduced business travel is going to be another particularly important area, particularly reduced flights. I think the impact of commuting might also be an area that attracts increased attention in the years ahead. Italy, for example, has introduced laws requiring large companies to engage what they call mobility managers, whose responsibilities now include reducing the use of private cars for commuting to work and promoting sustainable mobility. And I think as employers become increasingly conscious of their carbon footprint and the impact they have on the environment, we might also see recruitment decisions influenced by the environmental impact of a potential recruit's commute.
And finally, James, people have strong views on climate change and are increasingly likely to bring them to work. How do you envisage that playing out?
I think we can see this already. I think employers are going to have to work out how to manage conflicts at work between individuals or between individuals and the organization's own policies. Individuals are going to demand greater action from an organization for which they work. We might even see employers beginning to restrict the activities of employees where they consider that behaviors, even outside work, might damage the environmental reputation of the organization that they work for. For example, I can see that we might see organizations requiring senior managers to abandon any gas-guzzling cars for electric alternatives in order to better associate with the environmental strategy of the organization they work for.
Well, thank you very much, James. That was really interesting, and no doubt we'll start to see how things pan out very soon. If you'd like to read James's article, there's a link to it in the notes to this episode. The article's accompanied by comments from 12 of our law firms around the world, and you can read those too. There are some really fascinating insights. We've put James's details and also mine in the notes, so you can get in touch with us. If you're not sure who you need to speak to at Euthyboris, just contact me and I'll put you in touch with the right person in the right country. And if you'd like to take a deeper dive into any aspect of employment law, you can find loads of tools and materials at euthyboris.com. Thanks for listening and see you again soon. That's it for this episode of Talking Work, but we'll be back very soon with more insights from our guests from around the world. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. You can also visit euthyboris.com to access all our content, resources and tools.